All right, so I got a code sandbox repo open in case we need to do any demonstrations, or I can post a link to it afterwards if anyone wants to fork it, if we do anything worth saving. And if there's any specific questions, feel free to ask away. For exercise 3, let me take a look. I don't remember all the exercises I created off the top of my head. All right, so let's take a look. We've got exercise 3. Excuse me. Let's see. Nope. Where do we see copycat from?
Yeah, I actually just realized I may have them confused. It might be because I actually went and read through all of them to try to figure out, and I got stuck at 3. I wasn't able to go further from 3. So just trying to get clarity. Like when you say manipulate, something underneath the comment you made, like right there where it says counter, does that mean that whatever we're doing is only going to be within that counter div?
Yeah, so each comment and like component, like this is one thing, this is one thing, this is a separate, these are all separate things. The comments go with, like, so this comment here only pertains to this counter. So right. Yeah, so wire up the local state logic to make the counter buttons increment and decrement the count value in the component below. So you need to go into counter and you need to give it the logic of storing and updating the state based on the clicks. So right here, update this on a click logic, this one as well. So you need to add something to this component in order to make all this functionality work.
Okay, and so what we're adding could be anywhere within that component. It's not just in that space where you've put the comment.
Well, something definitely needs to go here, right?
Mhm.
Like the on-click handler right now is empty. For all intents and purposes, this comment is completely ignored. So we do have to have some logic here and here, because when we click this button, we definitely want to decrease the count and increase the count, right? But the rest has to go somewhere in the body of this function.
So when we're done doing each part of each exercise, we'll be uncommenting the comments and they'll be
Nope,
code
you
in their place.
You can leave the comments as is. You don't have to touch them. If you want to replace the comment with your logic, that works too.
Or like below it or whatever.
Sure. Yep.
Either way. Okay.
Yep. I think there was only one or two. Actually, I think it's in the homework one. This is the exercises one, right? Yeah. In the homework one that's due at the end of all 3 weeks. I believe one or two may have a comment that says, replace this comment with the component I want you to create, right? So that's just that comment's just a placeholder to show you where you need to put it. But you can leave the comment there if that helps.
How much of that assignment are we supposed to just be going ahead and doing on our own right now?
As much as you want.
Or feel that we can?
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's not all hands on deck. We're all doing it literally together. It's a little of both.
Yes. So that's the only stipulation, is that it's due at the end of 3 weeks. As we're going through the different, the different things we're learning, if you feel competent enough to tackle some of that stuff, go for it. Right. It's just due it in 3 weeks. So this one is more of like, hey, let's see what you can get done over the weekend and how far you can get with this.
Yeah.
Because this is all the stuff we covered. Let me go back to what's the last one? The last
Yeah, I started
one
watching the video from Tuesday forward just to refresh my brain.
Yeah.
It's a lot of it.
Yeah, so definitely, we definitely went over everything that's in here at working with arrays. In fact, you're building a little to-do like thing with this one, right? Same thing that we did on Thursday. So you can take what you learned on Thursday and apply it to this exercise right here. Outside of the exercises, are there any questions on the things that we went over? Like do I need to clarify anything or reiterate on anything? Like state, props, anything like that?
Maybe state a little bit.
State?
And I have got to get used to arrow functions. They are really a good thing, but I'm like, I don't get what's going on because it doesn't tell me everything, but that's my bad.
Joey, I don't know if your microphone is not working, but I can't hear you.
How about now? All right. Apparently this thing is, I don't know, not working. Can someone say something? I just need to make sure my speakers are.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Loud and clear. Not loud, but you're right. I hear you.
If it's
Okay, now.
that I have to charge it.
Yeah, no, that's a plugin. That's completely phantom power. So I don't know what's going on with that.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, well, the thing is, this laptop speaker picks up so much more than that thing does. So I just wanted to use that so you didn't hear my kids in the background distracting us. Okay, so we have one request for state, one request for props, and one for arrow functions. So let's do arrow functions real quick, just as a recap. There's two different types. There's an implicit return and an explicit return type. And arrow functions can be used any place a JavaScript value can be placed, or anything where you're assigning a value. So that means that we can put it in a variable like const my arrow function equals, and then I can give it an arrow function. So I can do this, and maybe this returns the value 3. Right, so this is just a quick function that says, hey, return the value 3. Now I'll just put implicit, and then we'll do another one, const my arrow function explicit. And implicit and explicit refers to the return type. So, or really the return statement. So here, these two functions are identical. Right? This just does it more succinctly. And implicit returns can only happen on one line. Even though I could do something, let's say I returned, oh, here's another good thing to know about. Let me leave those up there. So let's say my arrow function implicit object. So this thing's going to return an object. So actually, before I do that, let me do something else. Let me return, let's say, return object. Let's just make this so I don't go off the screen here, because you're going to see this a lot too. Right, so if I have an explicit return, you could probably hear my kids screaming, right? No? Okay, good. I guess this mic's doing okay. All right. So if I want to return an object with an explicit return, I could do that. I can say return object, right? And I could have A1, B2. And this totally works, right? So I've got a return statement in the thing that I'm returning, which happens to be an object with two properties. So if I wanted to do this with an implicit statement, let's say const fn return object, we'll just say am for implicit, I can't do this. This is not allowed. Anyone want to take a guess as to why this is complaining? What does this have in common with the one above it?
The same type of brackets.
Exactly. So when you put curly braces right after the arrow, that tells it, oh, it's a code block, right? So this thinks, oh, this is a block of code, and A:1 doesn't make sense in a block of code, right? So in order to return an object implicitly, we have to wrap it in parentheses. Because what's going to happen is JavaScript's going to look at the parentheses first, and it's going to say, oh, whatever's in here, I'm going to evaluate it. And that evaluation will result in an object. And then this function will return the object. So whenever you need to do something like that, make sure that you have parentheses around it so that JavaScript can do its proper evaluation. You're muted.
Do you ever use square brackets in React?
Sure, for arrays.
Okay, this is not an array. This is an object
Right, you can return.
of different, okay.
So I can
I
return.
see a bunch of things and my brain goes array.
Right, so arrays are always use square brackets with an array. Right, so I can say return array. And JavaScript knows what an array is. So this is totally fine because of the symbol, because of that square bracket that designates an array. It's either going to be, square brackets are only used for arrays or for
grabbing an index or property off of some array or object, right? Those are the only two reasons you'd be using them. The curly braces have two completely different meanings. They could either be a block of code or they can be an object. Right? It all depends on the context. Yeah. So when you're returning an object implicitly, make sure you put the parentheses around it. I could totally do this as well, and that's fine. Anything in parentheses will be evaluated. But as soon as I save it, my auto code formatter says, oh, you don't need those. It's completely optional. Right? But this one, absolutely it's needed. So that's a little bit about arrow functions. And then we can go over
Thank
props.
you. That filled in a few parts that they still kind of needed some putty to fill
Yeah.
in.
Oh, here's another thing
Thank you.
as well with implicit returns. So let's say I wanted to return, because JSX is valid. You can use JSX as a valid value to return to something. And let me do something. Let me go to a different file so it's not all on the same thing. 1 second. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, sorry, that was my wife apologizing for my child's behavior. Okay. What was I doing? Oh, I was creating a file. Sorry, got distracted there. Let's just say, what was I going to talk about? Do oh no, stuff. As long as it's a different file. All right. So with React, specifically JSX, we can put JSX inside a variable, and that's a completely valid value for that. So I'll just say sum JSX equals. Now this is not technically how you'd want to do this, but this is just for illustration purposes. I could say div p tag in there, something. This is how it formatted it there, which is perfect because it illustrates a point. So in fact, if this was, yeah, so this is just a constant. This is just some variable that holds the JSX markup structure, right? And that's totally cool. You can use that. You technically can use, I wouldn't do something like this, but you could totally do this. This is totally valid. And the other thing you can do is now I wouldn't want to do that because, in fact, let's do this. Some JSX component. And we'll just do the same thing. So this component is an implicitly returned arrow function. The only difference is that it's JSX and not like some object or some other value. But JSX is a totally complete or completely valid value to put in there. But what this does is this makes it a component. As far as React concerned, says, oh, there's a function and it's returning some JSX, that's a component. So the difference between these two is that this is a variable that holds some markup, and this is an actual component. This is not usable the same way that this is usable. So for this one, I would literally have to evaluate it like this inside my code because it's just a variable. Whereas this one down here, you have to actually like instantiate it as a component, right? I couldn't do that with this one because it's not a function. It's just some variable that holds some stuff, right? So if I do, let's do this. Let's actually do a little experiment here. I'm going to export these. We'll go back to app. We'll import them here. So we'll import from stuff. And there is some JSX and some JSX component. All right, so let's see what happens. Let's do the component one because that's going to be pretty obvious, right? We see it here. Let's do this. We can clearly see which one is which. All right, so now we have some JSX component. And I'll do this here. All right. So we're importing this thing. We're rendering it here just like a component because it's a function. And it's a function component. Now, if I were to try to do the same thing with some JSX, that's not going to work. And the reason is that it's not a function, so it doesn't know how to handle this thing. But if I were to do this, now I see it. Because now I'm evaluating some piece of JavaScript. And it just so happens that that some piece of JavaScript is a bunch of markup. Now, this is not really what I would call a best practice, because this is confusing. It's like, well, what is this thing, right? If I'm evaluating something like this and it's lowercase, it's like, oh, that's some variable. Okay, it must be some value somewhere. I'm not expecting that ever to be a bunch of JSX markup. I would expect JSX markup to be handed to me via some component, right? So that would just be like, I'd say don't do this because you're just going to confuse A, your future self, and B, whoever else might be helping you on your project, right? But I just wanted to illustrate the point that JSX is completely valid as a value to be stored someplace. And also this kind of like implicit, this isn't really implicit return. This is just wrapping a multi-line return value or value, but this one is implicitly returned. That's really what I wanted to demonstrate. And I just thought this was a good idea just to show that it's you can do it, but I wouldn't recommend it. Make sense? All right. Someone asked about props and then states. We'll do props first, because it's usually you learn about props before you learn about state, and they kind of to see the differences in them is it's nice to see. Okay, so let's do all this stuff on the screen is making my brain hurt. Right. And then get rid of that. Okay, props. In fact, let me bring that back. No, let's not, because I want something that's a little bit more explicit, right? So, oh, also one other thing, the fact that I labeled this stuff and I pulled in some component called some JSX component, also not a best practice. Let's go to components. There's some component already in there. I don't know what that is, so I'm not going to touch it. Instead, I'm going to create a new component here. I'll just place it here, and we'll just say message is like my favorite one for demonstrating props. So we will export message. We want to accept props to this thing. And we're going to return some markup. And then we'll do an H2. And then below that, we'll do a P tag. Let's just get this thing on the screen. We'll just say this is the title. This is the subtitle. All right. I'm going to import this thing. Oops. And then we'll just plop it right here. All right, so now we have this title and subtitle. Think of props as simply a way to pass data from a parent to a child. So this parent, let's just say has the title we want. Let's say const title equals the best, oops, best title ever. Oh, it should be capitalized. It's the title ever. All right. To get this into here, we have to pass it as a prop. So we're going to tell, hey, message, I'm going to pass you this piece of data, and I'm going to do it via this prop called whatever I'm going to call this thing. And we'll just call it title. Oops, whoa. Title equals, and then we have to evaluate what we're going to pass to it. So we'll pass in, to make this clear what's going on here, I'll call this the title variable. All right, so now message is receiving a prop called title, which happens to have a value of whatever this thing is. Everyone with me so far? Cool. So in message, to access it, every component is handed a props object. Whether or not you put it there, whether or not you declare the variable up here or not, it's still going to be passed props. So just because I'm not handling any props here doesn't mean that React is not passing it in. It absolutely is. We're just not doing anything with it yet. So here in our function signature, we'll say props. And then again, that's an object, always an object. And now we can access properties on that object. Well, the object being passed in is going to have a property of title. So let's grab that. In fact, let's do this. That way we can see it. There we go. All right, so we're going to grab, instead of title, we're going to evaluate some JavaScript. We want to evaluate props.title. Now I get the value that's being passed in. I could do the same thing with subtitle. I could say subtitle variable is somewhat okay. Subtitle. We'll pass in subtitle as a prop name. Pass in our variable, and now after it evaluates everything here, props.subtitle. And now I can see that value. I can use that value however I want inside the component. And what do you think determines what should come first? Should I declare props in here first, or should I pass them down in first? What do you think? Where should I define my props first? Should I define them here, where I'm calling, instantiating the component? Or should I do it in the component first before I even use them? What do you think?
Component first?
Component first, anyone else?
Question mark.
Now, the official answer is it doesn't matter. And here's the reason why. You may be working with this component, right? And you may say, oh, you know what? I think I really should be able to pass a title in with this. I really want to change the title. And then you come back to the component and you'd say, okay, I'm going to add a title prop and I'm going to put it here. Or you could be like, hey, this component, I know it's going to need a title from somewhere, so I'm going to do that first. Then when I call it, it doesn't really matter. But I just kind of wanted to bring it up in case that was ever a question of where should you do it first. Now, typically what happens is when you're creating the component, you'll probably decide 9 times out of 10 what the prop should be before you're done writing the component, before you're using it anywhere, right? Because the whole idea of the component is to display whatever you want to display. Just in this case, it's a title and a subtitle. And if you want those to come down from the parent, right? Because this is the parent, app is the parent, message is the child. So data flows in one way from parent to child. And so I'm passing the data down into the child, and here I'm receiving it. So if you know ahead of time that you need those, then absolutely you do that first. But if you're working with this and you're saying, oh, I really wish I could pass that in, well, it's my component, I can change it, so I'll add it in. So it doesn't really matter, but 9 times out of 10, you'll probably be declaring those props in the component first. That was just kind of like a trick question. Let's see.
So do I lose points or do I
Nope.
get half credit?
Nope, everyone's good. I just,
Yeah.
I've seen that question come up before, and the answer is, it doesn't matter. Sometimes you think about it after the fact, you know. As good as we can plan, sometimes we don't plan everything out right away. So, does props make sense though? Do I need to go over props again, or so we're good on props? Props is just, yeah, you just think of it as, hey, data goes from parent to child. I pass it down to the child via the props object, and these are the names of the properties that are going to be on that object. And that's literally it. Oh, and then of course we can't finish talking about props without talking about children. And let's do this. So everything under here will be under the subtitle. If we pass any children in, that's where they will render. So in order to utilize that, and it's kind of the same thing as like the props object. It kind of always gets past children if it finds it. It's like, oh, I see that you have some stuff here, right? I'm going to render it here because I see that children's coming in, so that's where I want it to go. You don't have to say children equals, right? You just have to put it between the open and closing tags, and React will take care of the rest for you. And then you can just expect that props.children will be here. Now, another thing though, if I take this away, this is still fine. It's just empty, right? So it's basically null. And React says, oh, that's null, so I'm not going to do anything with that. React knows how to render null. It just renders nothing for that. So it's okay to have a component that can render children, but sometimes never actually accepts it. That's fine. Just like any component that has a number of props, you don't have to pass those props in as long as that component can still, you know, it's doing what it's designed to do. It's just every prop that's on there, you should be able to have a way to handle it should it actually be passed to the component. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about state. And we'll create a new component. Let's see. Let's call this. We'll just call it storage. This is going to store some values. Export storage. And we'll do props just so we can see the difference between the two. We're going to return some markup. And we'll have a p tag and another p tag. And the first one, it's going to say props value, or let's say props dot value is going to be some props dot value, right? So we already talked about props. We'll pass in a prop. In fact, let's get this thing on the screen. So let's import storage from storage. And what was it? Value equals, I don't know, 3. But let's hide that. So it's the only thing we see on the screen. So props.value is equal to 3 because there's a prop called value. So we say props.value and we render it here. If I were to say state.value, now we want to store that thing inside the component. And to do that, we pull in our state hook. We pull in use state from React. And now we can store a piece of state. And if you remember, we get back an array of things. So the first thing we want is the thing that holds the value we want. And then an updater function. Set state. Use state. And well, actually, before we do that, let's not do state dot value. We'll just say value of state. Because I don't want to do the object thing yet. We just want a piece of state that's just a single value. We'll just say 42. So when this component first gets mounted to the DOM, we're going to create a piece of state called state. We're going to get back an updater function so we can actually create update this value. And the first value that exists in this variable here is going to be the value 42. So now we can come down here and we can say render state. Oops. And I see 42. So the difference between these two is that this is passed in from a parent, from the parent to the child. This exists only within the component. This is not passed anywhere at this point in time. Oh, and you cannot pass values from a child to a parent. It doesn't work that way. There's no reverse prop, right? It only goes from parent to child. There's other mechanisms for getting data to like the top of your application using different types of state patterns, but you can't just pass stuff back up to the parent. It doesn't work that way.
I think I remember we did something with Gus, and I can't remember what it's called now, to lift. I think it's lift.
Lift?
Anybody else remember how to push the stuff up?
Lift stuff up? Yeah, I mean, that doesn't really, we don't really do that in React.
Right.
There's other there's other frameworks and libraries that have like what are called two-way data bindings. Angular is one of them. You can have data synced up from a parent to a child, and it'll stay in sync that way. React doesn't work that way. It only renders from top down.
Question. I understand state, and then set state is what you say to
update it.
To update. Could you say update state, or in React is set state a given piece of vocabulary you have to use?
Now this isn't. If this was a class component, set state is a reserved word. It's this dot set state. That's how you set the state. But in reality, I could say, we'll just say cheese set. I mean, you get the idea, right?
Cut the cheese.
This is just whatever I.
Right. All right. But then use state. That's the resulting state from the change you made. Is that what that is?
Use state is the name of the function that React provides to us to create a piece of state. This is a React hook. So this is absolutely, this is absolutely called use state. We're importing it. We're importing this function from the React library.
Yeah.
And we're calling it here.
Okay. So what is that exactly? It's like a tool to manipulate the state, right? That you pull from React.
It's
sort of.
It's a tool. It's
the right word.
So what it is, it's a function that is responsible for managing a piece of state.
There you go. That's boom. And again, that's just the terminology that is used every time. All right, great.
Yeah, its sole purpose is to manage this one piece of state. That's all it does.
And it does it very well.
It's designed to do it very well. That's its one purpose in life, and it's excellent at it. So that's what that's for. Oh, I need to plug my laptop in. 1 second.
That's why I just jumped up from my chair. I thought I had plugged it in. I had it plugged into the laptop, but not to the wall. It's like, whoops.
Yeah, I don't want the stream to die on us in seconds.
A lot of physicality in IT, getting down on your knees and finding the cords.
Yeah, unfortunately, my knees aren't so great anymore. So
okay, tell me about it.
Okay, so are we good on state at this point? Or do we want to go a little further with the updating of state? Just as a recap. let's do this. Let's put in a button. We'll just say update cheese. We're calling it cheese now. We'll do an arrow function. And we're going to say set cheese. And we'll do. So when I click this, this function is going to accept this value. And it's going to change what exists in this variable. So whenever I call this function, whatever I pass it is now inside here. And what React's going to do is it's going to say, oh, hey, I see this changed. I see a piece of state has changed. I'm going to re-render this component with the changes. That's really what's happening, right? It's not like only this is changing. I mean, technically, that's what's changed, but this entire component was re-rendered completely. It's just React knew which part changed. It's only made this update in the DOM. But technically, this whole component kind of refreshed. But React was smart enough to know which part changed, and it only made that tiny little update. But this whole thing received that update.
It seems much more efficient.
Yeah, so
Dry. Yeah.
Kinda. It's what React does really well is if let's say you click this button and this variable was passed down to a child component and another child component, another child. Let's say there's 5 components that are dependent on this cheese variable. And because of that, maybe those components fire off different actions and those components update and all these different things. Let's say that 5 different refreshes are expected to happen. Now, React knows that all these things are going to happen like right away. So what React does is it kind of batches it together into like one update, and then it pushes it out to the DOM. So if things happen in like a succession where React can tell that it's going to need to re-render like all these different things, it'll handle it all at once. Like it kind of batches it, right? And then it handles it all at once. Now that can trip you up if you're expecting that when this changes, let's say you're expecting the next change to be, you're relying on the value that's in this cheese thing here. Well, by the time that batch happens, that may not be the value you were expecting to go off of. So you have to be careful. Now, we're not really going to see a lot of this sort of problem in the application that we're going to be making. But down the road, as as applications get more complex, you're going to run into these sorts of problems. And you have to kind of time things out. You have to say, oh, well, when this happens, how do I ensure that I'm getting the right value to make my next evaluation on? And there's patterns for handling that. And I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but I just want to make
asynchronous.
Yeah, asynchronous stuff is one way to handle it. There's a couple of different type of patterns you can use for updating state. Like, so for example, set cheese can take a value, or it can take a function. When that function gets called, whenever it gets called, I can look at the current state of cheese to determine if I should do what I need to do or not. Right. So depending, and that's one particular pattern where I can pass in a value and it'll change it, or I can pass in a function and that function has access to whatever the value of that state is. And I can determine how I want to update state next. Right. So that's how you get around the whole batching thing. Right. That's one way. Another way is to literally make your next action asynchronous. And so you're guaranteed that it's going to happen at another point in time. Right. So there's a couple of different approaches depending on the problem you're trying to solve. But React's really efficient. And I really wanted to bring up the fact that these things get batched together. So if you're ever in the future wondering why isn't this working the way it is? I've got 3 things going here and only one of them's getting updated. It's probably because it's batched together and you're relying on state to be one thing when it's already been updated to something else. So there's some gotchas in the future as things get more complex. We probably, like I said, we won't really come across that with what we're going to be doing, just because I don't want to inundate you with too many complexities. But most applications don't really suffer from that. It's the ones that get really complex that do. And by the time you come across that, you'll probably be competent enough to be able to figure it out. So, but just as a forewarning, there's certain orders that React does stuff. Let's see. So are we good on state right now? Any other questions on state? I see thumbs up, I see heads nodding. Cool. Any other questions on anything else at the moment? Anything else tripping you up? We've got another 20 minutes. Let's see. Okay. All right, so I'm going to close these out. Well, let me think. How are you guys feeling about arrays? Arrays are good. Any
I could use a raise.
yeah,
No,
we all could.
there had to be some kind of in there, right?
Yeah.
So, all right, I have a question for you guys. How many of you are still struggling with Ryan's New York Times API homework and getting it to show?
Oh yeah, if there's any questions on, I don't know his exact homework, but any questions on like asynchrony or any other sort of JavaScript stuff, you can ask them here as well, and I could try to answer them best I can.
So basically what he had them do, Joey, is they go to the New York Times API for the one for books, and he's just having them render the top 5 bestsellers for like each category. And the only reason I'm asking that is because I just went over with another student. She was getting things to render, but she was having trouble with, like, you get the data back. So the only way that I could do it, that I described it to her, was, okay, you get back your data, and then so you have this giant object. Well, the next, you need to do the next piece that you need, which was data.results. And then I had her just console log like pretty much everything that we were trying to target, so that they could see it, so that she could see it and then render it that way. And I don't know if it's because in his example, he gets kind of fancy when you inspect his code. So I don't know if that is something that some people were having an issue with, or if they just needed to go into it more. If you look, that's his example there.
All right. Is it okay to go on this, or am I giving away anything?
It's just going to show you what he ends up with.
Oh, I see. Okay, so he's just, I gotcha.
Right. And then I'm like, well, let's inspect his code. Let's see what he did. And he puts everything in the script and gets like fancy and renders everything through the script. And I'm like, oh, okay. So.
Oh, it's all in the script tag?
Yeah. But he's like, he told him, get your stuff back and then have it render in the HTML. So
you get back JSON, like your typical API endpoint, mapping over the stuff you get back. Yeah, it's literally just mapping over things.
Yeah, and there's a couple of ways that they can do, there's at least 3-4 loops that Max showed you guys in the to-do list that he commented out that you could use to apply to this. And that's basically when she and I got done, I said, take what Ryan wants you to do, get back the information that you want, like the 5 bestseller, an image or the title or whatever it was, and then go look at Max's to-do list and kind of put them together, because Max has them render results in HTML from the to-do list.
So this is the structure you get back, it looks like. This thing right here.
Yeah. So
you get back, so lists, so results.lists is an array of things, right? So maybe we should go over iterating through arrays.
Yeah,
Maybe that'll
because
help.
so we did results.lists. And then we did display name, and that gave her all of the display names. And then we went to books, which is another array.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
So let's talk about that. Let's actually talk about that.
Okay.
Let's do this. Let's just say.
Question. I tried going right to the different API URLs. I tried going right to the one that is the list of the top bestsellers, thinking that would be the most efficient way. And then from there, I could, skim off the 5. And I'm getting the feeling that I'm supposed to start bigger and work my way through, because I got a course violation and such, like I can't get right into that particular directory or whatever. So I don't know if Karen can speak to that, if I'm on the right track, realizing maybe I got too specific too soon, or.
I'm
I'm
not sure. Well, you were having an issue with cores.
Yeah.
My first JavaScript error is that, and I did send the stuff to Ryan, but haven't heard back yet.
Okay. So I think now there's certain steps you have to take in order to be able to get data from this API, right? You need an API key.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right. So you have to send that along. You have to send along probably a specific header in order to get the data. And then wherever you're sending it from, I don't know if there's a specific. So when I think about CORS errors, I think about, well, you've got 2 domains that, one domain is saying, I'm sorry, but you can't.
Yeah.
You're not allowed here, right?
I'm not allowed to go right to that list of the
Right.
top sellers yet. I have to come at it from a different angle and work my way to
So it
extract.
sounds like you need to take care of the API key stuff and send the right header.
Yeah, and I went to the wrong one.
Okay, so so you'll have to
Okay.
set that up properly.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't done his exercise, so I'm not exactly sure. But I can talk about iterating over arrays, right? So here's their example right here, right? This is just a single list with looks like a single book in it, but we can actually do.
Their example might be yes, because
Very simplified. Let's do this.
Yeah.
Let's make 2 books.
Right, because they get 5 back for each category.
Well, I don't want to give
No.
away.
I'm not saying do 5. I'm just
Answers.
saying that's if they have 2, then they should be able to do it with the 5 on their own.
It doesn't like something. Oh, I know what it did. Hold on a second. I'm outside of the. I duplicated the wrong thing. There we go. So now we've got that. I'll just put 2 in here. It's enough to demonstrate. Okay, so in fact, let's. This probably isn't the right environment to do this in. Let me open up a new tab. Let's see. Sources. Summary snippet. We'll just say, we'll call this response. All right, is this font size okay? Okay, so let's take a look at this response. I'm just going to run this so it's available. I'll just type response. Okay, and here's what we got back from the New York Times, according to their example. We've got, like this one, is this still okay? It's just really large on my screen. Okay. We get back an object. It looks like there's a copyright, there's num results. It looks like there's 210 results and whatever this results thing they gave us back. Here's our results right here. It's got a status. So let's open up results. That's an object. This object has a bestseller's date property. It's got a lists property. It's got a published date property. We can tell that lists is an array because of the symbols it's showing me. It's telling me that it's an array of objects because that's what this is telling me. So let's open that up. We get an array of one element. There's only one thing in this. Let's see, at element 0, we've got this thing. We've got a list, one list. This list has 2 books. It's an array of 2 things. Here's element 0 and element 1. Right, so there's 2 different things here. That's cool. In fact, just to make this clearer, as it's showing that first, put a 1 in front of this. And I'll put a 2 in front of this, just to make it clearer in our example here. So now let's come back down here and take a look at the response. So we'll open up our object, we look at results, we look at lists. We've got 2 books. We've got book 1, book 2. Cool. All right, so how do we iterate over arrays? Well, first of all, we have to get to the array. And since this is a giant object that we get back, this giant JSON object, we could say, well, I want to, let's see, I got response dot, well, it's not a copyright, it's results. Response dot results dot lists. This is an array, okay? So I can't go into it with the dot syntax anymore, right? Because if I do that, if I do dot, I'm not going to see any properties of the objects that are in that array, because quite frankly, the array itself is not, the array object itself is not its contents. It's just a container for things. So what do I have access to with the dot syntax are all the methods for traversing the array. So there's flat map, there's for each, there's map, I can pop things off, I can push things on, right? So these are all the things all the functionality that I can use with an array, but it's not the stuff that's in it. So how do we get to the stuff within it? Well, one thing we could do is we could for each over it and pull things out, right? We could do it that way. We could map over it and get a new array of things to work with, but all we're doing is getting a new array. So maybe what we want to do is let's first say, well, let's just get the list, right? So we'll say var list, is it lists? Lists equals response dot results dot lists. So that's the first thing we want. So now we've got lists. Cool. So it's an array of one thing. All right, so now how do we get into here? Well, it depends on what we want to do with it, right? So inside here, we want to get to the books. Okay. So now we have to get down into that somehow. And we'll pull out, let's just try to display the title of each one of these things. Let's just try to do that. So we want to get, the only thing we want is a, like, I don't know, an array of titles. That's all we want. So we could say lists dot, or let's see, what could we do? We could say dot map. Now, if we map over this thing for each list, we want to do something. We want to return, what do we want to return? We want to return the book itself, maybe. So we could say, in fact, let's do this up in here so I don't lose everything every time I refresh. So we'll say var books equals, now it depends how many lists you have. We know we only have one list. So yeah, so this can get complex. I can see why this can confuse people. Okay, so books, we'll do lists.map. So we only want the books. So we're going to say, for every list, I want you to give me back the books property off that list, right? Because if we look at this list object has a property called books, which is another array, right? So I want the books from every list. So we'll do that. Enter. Let's see what we got. If you look at books, I see I have an array of one item, and that one item happens to be another array of books. Is this making sense so far? So the first element in this array of books is another array, because every element in an array could be anything we want. It could be an array, it could be an object, a number, text, function, it could be anything, right? It could be a completely giant structure of other things. So great. So now how do we get to, let's say we want to display all the names, or what was it, all the titles? Yeah, we want to display all the titles of every book. Well, since each book, each books in this list is an array of books, let's dive down even further. So we'll say var titles equals books dot, and we're going to map over each one of these things. And what we want to return, let's see, this is the best way to do it. Let's find out. For every book, we want to return the title. But here's the thing. Well, this is a book list is really what it is, right? For every book, every one of these, we're going to receive a list, right? So everything's an array. So we're going to receive a book list. Oh, I know. Let's do this. We'll say, yeah, we'll leave it like that. I think that should be fine. So for every one of these, maybe this will make it clearer. Let's see. List of book arrays. All right, we'll just call it what it is. For every one of the arrays in here, we'll call this a book array. We want to get all the titles out of those, right? So for every one of those, let's make this, let's do this. We'll say we want to return, what do we want to return? Well, we can't just say book array.title, right? Because this is an array of things. So now what do we have to do? We have to say, okay, well, I need to get all the stuff out of there. So I need another variable to hold all the values of that array, right? Because if I map over it, I'm going to get a new array, right? So now I can say, okay, well, we'll call this the actual books themselves equals book array dot map. Actually, we'll say book titles because we want the book titles. Book titles So for every book in this book array, we want the book.title. Okay, so now I have an access to this thing. So now I have access to all the titles, right? So I could say, okay, I'm going to return my book titles. Enter. Let's see what we got in titles. I have 2 titles right there. I just pulled them out. Now it's up to me to decide what I want to do with these things. Do I want to render them to elements on the screen? Do I want to, I don't know, manipulate them in some other way? But since this giant object contains a property that's an array, now I have to map over that thing to get the stuff out of it. That's also an array, right? So I have to map over those for each one of those, and I get all my titles. So you kind of have to drill down into it. You kind of have to, you know, kind of brute force your way down through it. The larger these structures get, the more you have to do things like this, right? So now I didn't take a closer look at the example he's doing, but I can see how that can get confusing, because how do you handle each level? The way I like to think about it, and the way it's always helped me, is I take it one level at a time, right? Just like I'm doing here. Well, this is my top level of lists. For every list, I want to do this thing. And that gets me back an array of arrays. So every one of those book arrays, I want to pull out the title for every book in there. And I just have to kind of step through until I get to what I want.
When I was helping the other student, that's pretty much what we did. We started with the first object, and then I just did console.log. Like each level farther in that we wanted to go, I did a console.log with her. And I'm like, okay, so now we need to get to the next step. So let's do console.log and go in that far. And then and we also looked at the examples you guys did with Max with the to-do list, and also when you did the schools where he had the 3 different schools with the students and the teachers. That's a really good example of how to go down into what you're getting back here.
So I'm going to just do something real quick.
So basically, I cheated trying to go to the bottom of the hole right off the bat, and that's why I couldn't get in. The server knew.
Let's see if this will. So now let's do something real quick just to see if this will work. Body's not defined. Oh, I'm sorry. Document. Got it. Body. Let's see it. Did I do that right? Is it in HTML? Maybe I didn't do the right property name. Yeah, that's what it is. Okay. So cool. So now that I have, I'm gonna refresh this. Now that I have these titles, right? I can render those to the screen just with my little helper here. So all this does is renders a div to the screen with some text in it. So I could say, hey, titles that for each title, right? I want to append a div with that title. Looks terrible, but there they are. The gangster 2. Oh, what did I do? Each one of these things, yeah. So titles is an array. 2. I wonder why it rendered that. Plus, let's take a look. What do we got here? Oh, that's interesting. Oh, I know why. These aren't separate elements. They're the same element. Okay. That's another kind of caveat to working with things in the DOM. Div was already created. I think that's, oh, okay. Well, anyways, but that's how I got them to the screen. I eventually kind of brute forced my way down through them until I got to the level I want for the data that I want. And then I just iterated over them and did something with it. In fact, I could just do, let's do this. I think it's because it's a var. Let's try that. Oops. Probably have to refresh. No, it's not it. I mean, you kind of get the point though, right? How to iterate over things. You just have to look at the level of where you're at. So I got my response, right? I just look at it and say, okay, well, I need results. So response.results. What is that? Okay, that's an object. Oh, I see there's my list, right? Then you dive into that. And say, okay, how do I get through that? And you dive into that. I would just save your progress along as you go, right? Because if you nest too many functions together, it starts to look kind of crazy, right? Does that help?
Thank you, and thanks for bringing it up, Karen.
You're welcome. I had noticed that there were a few more students that were saying they still weren't getting that to work.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being there, because, it's like you think you can do this stuff. You don't want to be the only one that can't or whatever. And then you find out, well, guess what? So thank you. And I know my mistake was trying to go right to it right off the bat, which kind of defeats the purpose of the exercise. You can't dig if you start at the bottom. So, and I couldn't get in at the bottom. It wouldn't let me. So
It takes a while. There's days where I still struggle with going inside of objects and arrays that are nested deep down inside.
oh yeah, it's you just gotta go one thing at a time. Thank you.
Console.log has become my best friend.
I see what happened. That's why. It's still an array within an array. That's why it was.
Mm-hmm.
I just noticed it. So there. Yeah. So you have to be careful of what the structure is you're iterating over and what you're displaying.
Yeah, and I can't remember off the top of my head if he just wanted titles or he wants the bibliographic information about the books as well, because that adds a whole other layer to it. I'm a librarian. I can't help it.
Yeah, it all depends on what you're supposed to render to the screen.
Yeah, and I'd have to go back and see.
There was anything specific from what I could see, maybe just like the title.
Okay.
But he said you could do, I think, what you wanted, like you could do the book image if you wanted to, or.
Mm-hmm. Yep. When you said the books, I thought, well, that could mean.
Right.
And is it the right book? Because, do you want to deliver the large print one to the list? Do you want to, it's like a library catalog, but yeah, it'll be fine. Thank you.
All right, so let's see. Yeah, did he go over that in class? Because this is just steps to do it, but I don't know what it shows the New York Times bestsellers list. Yeah, so it's up to you to decide how you want to display it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously you'd want book titles. But cool. All right. Well, hopefully that the kind of deep dive into it helps. Just look at every level of that structure and see what it is. Right. So if you can only get so far. If you get to an array, it's like you can't use the dot syntax anymore. Now you got to dive into that array. Right. So we're past time. Are there any other very quick questions that maybe we want to squeeze out? Anything with React or anything with functions? Anything else? Any other JavaScript thing?
Just a thank you on my part,
You're
very
welcome.
much. Karen too.
You're welcome.
All right, cool.
I have
All
a
right, so
Joey, but
tomorrow, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, I don't want to confuse them. So go ahead and say what you said, but I have a quick
Oh.
question for you.
Yeah, so tomorrow, 11:30 to 12:30. It's another hour-long office hour. So I know there were some other people that wanted to attend that one, so I will be here. And then, yeah, that's it, just as a reminder. And what was your question?
So my question is, and does React have two-way data binding?
No.
Okay. That's why I wanted to ask, because
Yeah,
Angular.
so the short answer is no. The long answer is no.
Okay. Okay, because that was one of the contentions of why he was using Angular, was because, oh, there's two-way data binding. Okay, why do you need it?
Yeah, so React. Now, I learned Angular before I learned React. So two-way data binding was, my first, like, well, how do I do two-way data binding? And then when I realized you don't, I was like, okay, well, what if I want to accomplish this particular thing? And the one-way data flow, it's called unidirectional data flow, top down.
Right.
It still works to achieve the same result as two-way data binding does. You just handle it a different way, right? And so kind of the complexity of the two-way data binding, that's hard to do with just a bunch of functions, right? Without getting really, really, really fancy. And so what React does, it says, okay, you can put data wherever you want, but when it gets rendered, it will never go back up, right? So you can only go down a certain way. But if you need to get data, let's say you have a component tree that's 10 levels deep. And on the top level, you have a piece of state, right? It's an object. And it's got, like, I don't know, 100 different properties on it. And so 10 levels deep, you have a component that wants to change that data. Well, so that component would be given access to it. You could either do it by props, drill it all the way down, or there's another thing called context. It allows you to kind of traverse that whole tree, get data down to a specific point. And what you can give to that bottom element, that bottom component, you can give them a function that updates the state up here.
Okay.
It's not two-way data binding, right? I'm not
Right.
typing
No,
down
it's
here.
not,
You know what I
because-
mean? It's not.
yeah.
It's still going down only one way, but you can still change the data up there. It's just not the exact same pattern, and it doesn't require as much complexity. It's just, hey, here's a function, because you remember a function, anywhere you call that function, you have access to where it lives, right?
Right.
The whole closure thing, right? So if I define a function way up here and I use it down there, it still has access to all the stuff up here. So that's how you get around that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Nope. It does.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, cool. All right, everyone. If you're going to be here tomorrow, I'll see you tomorrow. Otherwise, I'll see you on Monday.
Have a good night, guys.
All right, have a good one.